You are walking into the village on a grey afternoon, when the light is already beginning to fail, and the whole sky above the valley has settled into a single motionless sheet of cloud that seems to press the remaining warmth out of the air. The road beneath your feet is hard, with frozen mud that holds the shapes of cart ruts and hoof prints as if they were cast in old iron, and your boots make a dry scraping sound with every step. You are the Saltpeter man, sent here by the county committee to dig and scrape and boil the nitre-rich earth from the ground beneath the dovecote at the edge of the common. And you have been walking since morning through a landscape that has offered nothing but bare hedgerows, sleeping fields, and the occasional black silhouette of a rook lifting from a tree. Now the village appears slowly, as a collection of low roofs and thin lines of smoke rising straight into the still air, and you pause for a moment at the top of the slight rise to take in the shape of the place that will be your home through the winter months. The cold does not bite sharply, but instead spreads itself evenly across your face and hands, settling into the folds of your coat and the spaces between your scarf and your collar. Snow is piled against the hedgerows and drifts that have hardened into crusted white banks, and in the deeper shade beneath the old oak at the crossroads there is still a patch of untouched powder that glows faintly with the last light of the afternoon. You shift the weight of the wooden shovel on your shoulder, feel the iron rake bump gently against your thigh, and tighten your grip on the handle of the leather bucket that swings from your other hand. There is no hurry in your body, no sense of urgency pushing against the stillness of the day, because the work you have come to do is slow work by its nature, and it will begin when the conditions are ready and not a moment before. The first houses you pass are of the same grey stone that seems to grow out of the fields themselves, their roofs thick with thatch that has darkened over years of rain and frost until it is almost the colour of the earth. Smoke oozes from the chimneys and hangs in a flat layer just above the rooftops, thickening the air with the smell of burning wood and the faint, sour note of damp wool drying. A dog watches you from a doorway without barking or moving its head, its eyes following your progress with the blank patience of an animal that has learned to conserve its energy against the cold. From somewhere deeper in the village, you hear the regular thud of an axe striking into wood, a sound that seems to measure the passing of your footsteps as you move along the lane. No one comes out to greet you, and you do not expect anyone to, because the committee's letter will have arrived ahead of you, and the villagers will know that a Saltpeter man is coming to work. The dovecote, and in these times that is simply a fact to be accepted, like the weather or the rising price of grain. At the centre of the village the lane widens into a small market square that is empty now, except for a stone trough frozen solid and a cart tilted on its side with one wheel missing. You turn left where the road forks and take the narrower track that leads past the church and out toward the common. And here the snow lies thicker because the hedgerows are taller and the sun has not touched the ground since November. The track curves gently around the side of a low hill, and then quite suddenly the dovecote comes into view, and you stop again to look at it properly for the first time. The dovecote stands on a slight rise at the edge of the common, a squat circular tower built of the same grey stone as the village houses, with a conical roof of old tiles that have shifted over the years into a pattern of overlapping greys and browns like the scales of a sleeping creature. The walls are thick and windowless, except for a single narrow opening high up where the birds come and go, and around the top of the tower there are several rows of small square nest holes set directly into the stone, each one a dark, empty socket. The whole structure has a settled look, as if it has been growing out of the ground for centuries and has finally decided to stop. In the fading afternoon light, the stone appears almost warm, a trick of the grey and the soft gold of the low clouds. But you know that the walls will be cold to the touch, and that the earth inside has not seen sunlight in living memory. You walk toward the dovecote along a path that is only faintly visible beneath the snow, a depression in the white that suggests other feet have passed this way before, though not recently. When you reach the low wooden door, you set down your tools and your bucket and stand for a moment with your hand on the cold iron latch, listening. Inside there is a soft, continuous cooing, a sound so low and steady that it seems like part of the building itself, a deep breathing that goes on whether anyone is there to hear it or not. The birds are quiet now in the winter dark, huddled together on their ledges, and you know that when you open the door they will stir only a little before settling again. You lift the latch and push the door inward, and the smell that comes out to meet you is dry and sharp, and mineral, the accumulated breath of hundreds of years of nesting, a rich ammoniac scent that speaks of nitrates seeping slowly downward through the packed earth floor. The interior is darker than the outside, but enough grey light comes through the high opening and the gaps around the doorframe for your eyes to adjust. The floor is a single circular space, perhaps 12 paces across, and it is covered with a thick crust of droppings and dust and fine grey feathers that have been trampled and compressed over generations until they form a solid layer like old plaster. In the center of the space, the crust rises slightly into a low mound, and around the walls it is thinner, worn down by the passage of birds and perhaps by others who have come before you to scrape what they needed. The air is still and cold, and yet it feels alive with something invisible. The chemistry that has been working slowly in the dark for all the years the dovecote has stood. You step inside and close the door behind you, and the change in the sound of the world is immediate. The faint hollow noise of the wind against the hedgerows is gone, replaced by the close quiet of the stone walls and the gentle rustling of the birds shifting on their perches high above. There are nests in the upper darkness, little cups of twig and grass wedged into the holes, and from them you can hear an occasional soft pip, the sound of a single bird speaking to itself in its sleep. The dovecote feels like a room that has been waiting for you, not in any conscious sense, but simply as a place that is ready to be used, its deep, cold earth ready to give up the nitrates that have been gathering since long before the war began. You walk slowly around the inside of the wall, letting your eyes follow the curve of the stone, noting the places where the floor crust is thickest and the places where it has begun to crack and lift at the edges. Your boots leave shallow prints in the grey dust, and you think about how many bucketfuls of this earth you will need to carry out before the spring comes. The committee's letter had spoken of an expected yield of 20 pounds of pure saltpeter from a dovecote of this size, given a full winter's work. But you have done this before, and you know that the earth gives what it gives, and that no amount of hurry will change the chemistry. The nitrates are there, bound up in the droppings of the soil, and your job is only to coax them out with water and ash and fire, one slow step after another. After a few minutes you come back to the door and step outside again into the afternoon, which has now deepened into a kind of grey dusk that seems to come from all directions at once. The snow has begun to fall again, not heavily, but in small sparse flakes that drift down with no wind to push them, each one settling onto the crusted surface of the earlier snow as lightly as a feather. You pick up your tools and walk to the shed that has been prepared for you. On the far side of the common, a low structure of rough poles and thatch that stands next to a shallow pit and a row of copper kettles arranged on flat stones. The shed is open on one side to let the steam escape, and inside there is a wooden trough, a paddle, a barrel of wood ashes, and a stack of split hazel sticks for the fire. A clay-lined leaching pit has been dug into the earth a few paces away, with a wooden spigot at its base and a wide copper pan set beneath it to catch the liquid. Everything is ready, left by whoever was here before you or by the village men under the committee's instructions, and you nod to yourself at the neatness of the arrangement. You set your shovel and rake against the wall of the shed and place the bucket upside down on the end of the trough. The cold is finding its way deeper into your bones now that you have stopped moving, so you gather a handful of the dry hazel sticks and a few larger pieces of alder from the woodpile, arrange them in the ring of stones that serves as the fire pit, and strike a spark from your tinderbox into a nest of dry grass. The fire catches after a few gentle breaths, and a small yellow flame appears, cut by the stones, sending a thin line of smoke up into the thatch where it coils and disappears through a gap left for that purpose. You hold your hands over the warmth and watch the snow falling outside the open side of the shed, the flakes now thicker and softer, each one vanishing as it touches the ground. The fire crackles quietly, and you sit on a low stool that someone has placed beside the hearth, a simple three-legged thing of turned wood, worn smooth by use. From here you can see the dovecote across the common, its round shape already blurring in the falling snow, and you can hear the faint sound of the village waking into its evening routines. A woman calling a child inside, the bark of a dog, the distant clank of a pail. You will need to bring your bedding from your pack and make a place to sleep in the corner of the shed where the straw is piled, and you will need to fetch water from the brook when the light comes back in the morning. There are things to do, but none of them are urgent, and the fire is warm, and your body is heavy with the miles you have walked since sunrise. You think about the work that will begin tomorrow. The slow scraping of the crust from the dovecote floor with the iron rake, the careful mixing of the earth with wood ashes in the trough, the pouring of water through the mass in the leaching pit, the boiling of the brown liquid in the copper pan, the skimming of the scum, the carrying of the hot pan out into the cold air, where the saltpeter crystals will form in fine white needles as the night comes on. The process is as familiar to you as the shape of your own hands, and you know that it will fill the winter days one after another in a rhythm that asks nothing of you but patience and attention. The war is somewhere else, wherever wars go, and what happens here is only the quiet extraction of something the earth has already made. When the fire has burned down to a steady bed of coals, you rise and unpack your bedroll, spreading it over the straw in the corner of the shed and folding your coat into a pillow. The snow continues to fall, soft and persistent, and the world outside is silent now, except for the occasional creak of a tree branch settling under its new weight. You lie down and pull the blanket up to your chin, and your breath rises in a small white plume that catches the glow of the coals before drifting up into the thatch. The dovecote waits in the darkness, its earth floor thick with the slow accumulation of centuries, and somewhere inside it the birds are sleeping with their heads tucked under their wings. Tomorrow you will begin, but tonight there is only the sound of the snow and the warmth of the embers and the long, quiet pull of sleep reaching up from the cold ground to claim you. The morning arrives without a sunrise, the grey light thickening by degrees until the darkness inside the shed has simply become a deeper shade of the same grey that fills the open doorway where the snow has stopped falling and now lies still and silent across the common. You wait because the cold has found its way through the straw and into the small of your back, and you lie for a while without moving, watching your breath rise in short pale clouds while your body slowly remembers its shape. The fire has gone out during the night, and the coals in the hearth are cold and black beneath a dusting of ash that the wind has stirred across the stones. The quiet is deeper than any quiet you have known in the towns, a layered stillness made of the muffling weight of the snow and the heavy stone of the dovecote standing 50 paces away, and the simple absence of any human voice. After a time you push back the blanket and sit up, rubbing your hands together and stamping your feet against the packed earth floor until the stiffness begins to loosen. You step outside and the air wraps around your face with a clean sharpness that smells of nothing at all except cold itself. The village is hidden behind a low bank of fog that has settled into the valley overnight, and the only visible feature of the world is the round bulk of the dovecote rising out of the white like a small hill that someone has shaped by hand. The roof tiles are edged with a thin rim of frost, and the high opening near the top is a black rectangle against the pale stone. You collect a handful of dry sticks from the woodpile and rekindle the fire, setting a small pan of water over the flames to warm while you eat a piece of hard bread and a strip of dried meat from your pack. The routine of these small actions loosens the last of the sleep from your limbs, and by the time the water is steaming, you are ready to begin the day's work. You walk across the common toward the dovecote carrying the iron rake and the leather bucket, leaving a fresh trail of footprints in the untrodden snow that fell during the night. The path you made yesterday has been completely erased, and the white surface is smooth and unbroken, except for the faint tracery of bird tracks near the base of the tower where a few pigeons have come down to search for grit. You pause at the door and look up at the rows of nest holes set into the stone, each one a square of pure darkness, and you can hear the birds inside stirring as the light grows, a low, continuous murmuring that sounds like water moving through an underground channel. When you open the door, the same sharp mineral smell rises to meet you, rich and dry and ancient, and you step inside and let your eyes adjust to the dimness. The interior of the dovecote by morning light is a study in shades of grey, the curved wall rising from the pale crust of the floor up into the deeper shadows of the roof, where the wooden beams cross and recross like the ribs of an upturned boat. The nest holes begin about halfway up the wall and continue in regular rows all the way to the top, each one a small alcove dug into the thickness of the stone, and from these alcoves you can see the round heads of pigeons looking down at you with bright, unblinking eyes. There must be several hundred birds in the tower, and their soft cooing fills the space with a sound so constant that after a few moments you cease to notice it at all, the way you cease to notice the sound of your own breathing. The floor is what you have come for, and you lower yourself into a crouch and set the bucket aside so that you can study it properly with your hands and your eyes. The surface is not earth in any ordinary sense, but a deep accumulation of droppings and dust and fallen feathers that have been building up since the dovecote was first constructed. Perhaps 100 years ago, or perhaps much longer, the oldest layers at the bottom have been compacted by the weight of everything that has settled above them, and they have undergone a slow chemical change that has turned them from simple waste into something else entirely. A grey-white crust that crumbles under pressure, but holds its shape until you touch it. You scrape the edge of the rake across a small patch near the wall, and a fine powder lifts into the air and hangs there for a moment before sinking back down onto the toes of your boots. This crust is thicker in some places than in others, and you spend the first part of the morning mapping its contours with your feet and your rake, near the walls where the birds roost on the lowest ledges, and their droppings fall in a constant, gentle rain. The accumulation is deepest, rising in places to the height of your ankle. Toward the center of the floor, the crust thins out a little, worn down by the occasional passage of a human visitor, or by the scraping of the birds themselves when they come to the ground to peck at stray seeds. Directly beneath the high opening there is a circular patch where rainwater has seeped in over the years and created a harder, darker crust that looks almost like old beeswax, smooth and slightly glossy in the dim light. You tap this patch with the handle of the rake, and it gives back a solid sound, a dull thok that tells you the nitrates here have been concentrated by the repeated wetting and drying into something particularly rich. You begin to work in a methodical way, starting at the wall directly opposite the door and moving slowly to the left in a clockwise direction. The rake is a simple tool, a flat iron head with 6 short tines, and you use it to loosen the top layer of the crust with short pulling motions that break the surface into small irregular clods. Each stroke of the rake produces a dry scraping sound that echoes softly off the stone walls, and after a dozen strokes you pause and use your hands to gather the loosened material into a small pile beside your bucket. The crust comes away in pieces that range in size from fine grey powder to chunks the size of a hen's egg, and each piece releases a fresh wave of the ammoniac scent that is the signature of nitrates decaying slowly back into the air. The work is not strenuous, but it is steady, and after half an hour you have cleared a patch of floor about the size of a cartwheel, exposing the darker earth beneath the crust. The exposed underlayer is moist and cool to the touch, and its color is a deep, rich brown that stains your fingers when you press them into it. This is the active zone where the nitrates are most concentrated, the layer that has been fed by decades of droppings filtering downward through the crust above. You take a handful and crumble it between your palms, feeling its texture, which is something between damp sand and crumbled cake, and you can smell the sharpness of it even through the cold. This is the earth you will carry to the shed and mix with ashes and leach with water. But before any of that can happen, you must first break the crust above it and gather enough raw material to fill the leaching pit. You estimate that the floor of the dovecote holds perhaps 2 feet of accumulated material in the deepest parts, and that a winter's steady work will see you scrape and carry away the whole of it, right down to the natural soil beneath. The light from the doorway shifts almost imperceptibly as the morning passes, the grey rectangle on the floor moving from the western curve of the wall toward the center of the space, and then slowly toward the east. The pigeons come and go through the high opening, their wings making a soft rushing sound as they pass in and out of the darkness, and occasionally a small puff of dust or a stray feather will drift down from the upper ledges and settle on your shoulder or the back of your hand. You work without hurry, pausing often to straighten your back and to watch the birds, because there is no advantage to rushing when the material will take just as long to leach and boil, whether it is gathered in a day or a week. The cold inside the dovecote is a dry cold, less penetrating than the damp chill of the outside air, and as long as you keep moving your body generates enough warmth to keep the stiffness at bay. By the time the light in the doorway has begun to take on the faintest suggestion of the afternoon's decline, you have filled the bucket halfway with the loose grey crust and the darker earth beneath it. You carry it outside and set it down on the packed snow beside the door while you go back inside for a second inspection of the floor. The patch you've cleared is about 3 feet wide and follows the curve of the wall for a length of perhaps 6 feet, and the exposed, darker earth glistens faintly in the low light, still holding a trace of moisture from the deeper layers. You kneel and press your hand flat against it, feeling the cold seep upward into your palm, and you think about the invisible chemistry that has been at work here for all the years. The dovecote has stood, the slow transformation of bird waste into nitrates, and then into something that could be carried away and burned and turned into smoke and force. It is a strange thought, and you let it pass without holding on to it, because what matters now is only the scrape of the rake and the weight of the bucket and the long, quiet succession of days that stretch ahead of you into the heart of the winter. Outside, the fog has begun to lift a little, and you can see the grey shapes of the village houses clustered around the church at the far end of the common. A thin column of smoke rises from one of the chimneys and is immediately flattened by the still air into a horizontal smear that hangs above the rooftops. Somewhere a horse whinnies, and the sound carries across the snow with a strange clarity that makes it seem closer than it is. You pick up the bucket and begin the 27 paces to the shed, your feet finding the path by habit now, even though the morning snow has covered all trace of yesterday's tracks. The bucket is not heavy, and you swing it slightly with each step, listening to the soft rustle of the earth shifting inside it. At the shed, you tip the contents of the bucket into the wooden trough and shake out the last clinging crumbs of grey powder. The pile of raw earth is still small, a modest heap in the bottom of the trough, but it will grow over the coming days into something large enough to work with. You set the empty bucket aside and use the paddle to break up a few of the larger clods, crushing them against the side of the trough until they crumble into a uniform texture. The smell of ammonia rises strongly from the disturbed material, and you step back a little to let it dissipate before continuing. When the earth is broken down to your satisfaction, you cover the trough with a piece of old sacking to keep the wind from drying it out too quickly, and then you go back to the fire and add a few more sticks to bring the flames up again. The rest of the afternoon passes in the same quiet rhythm. You make 3 more trips to the dovecote, each one yielding another half bucket of scraped earth, and by the time the light begins to fail in earnest, the pile in the trough has grown to a respectable size, perhaps enough to fill the leaching pit a quarter of the way. Your back aches dully between your shoulder blades from the repeated bending and scraping, and your hands are raw with the cold and the friction of the rake handle. But the ache is a familiar one, and it does not trouble you. You have done this work before in other villages and other dovecotes, and you know that your body will learn the shape of it within a few days and stop complaining. Before the dark comes down completely, you take a walk around the outside of the dovecote, inspecting the stonework and the ground that surrounds it. The tower is built on a slight mound of earth that raises it above the level of the common, and the base of the wall is encircled by a narrow apron of packed gravel that has been scattered with straw to give the birds a place to land. The snow has drifted against the north side of the tower in a smooth white curve that reaches almost to the bottom row of nest holes, and you note that in a few weeks it may be deep enough to block the door if the winter turns harsh. You make a mental mark to keep the entrance cleared, and then you turn and walk back toward the shed where the fire is waiting and the thin light of the day is already draining out of the sky. Inside the shed you sit on the stool and hold your hands over the flames, feeling the warmth spread slowly through your fingers and into your wrists. The pile of scraped earth in the trough gives off its sharp scent even through the sacking, and you think about tomorrow's work, more scraping, more carrying, the gradual filling of the trough until there is enough material to begin the mixing with ashes and the long, slow process of leaching. The dovecote will not run out of earth, not this winter or the next, and the birds will continue to add to the accumulation even as you remove it, so that the work is in some sense endless, a cycle that predates you and will outlast you by centuries. You find this thought strangely restful, and you sit with it for a while as the fire crackles and the darkness gathers itself in the corners of the shed. When the flames have died down to embers, you eat another piece of bread and drink a cup of warm water, and then you lie down on your bedroll and pull the blanket up to your ears. The cold presses in from all sides, but the straw beneath you is dry and the blanket is thick wool that holds the warmth of your body close. You listen to the small sounds of the night settling over the common, the distant bark of the dog in the village, the whisper of a breeze stirring the thatch above your head, and beneath everything, the faint, continuous cooing of the pigeons safe inside their stone tower. The floor of the dovecote waits in the darkness with its layers of fallen earth, and its slow chemistry still working away in the cold, and you know every inch of it now, every rise and hollow, every patch of harder crust, and every pocket of darker soil. Tomorrow you will scrape another section and carry another bucket and add another layer to the pile in the trough, and the winter will move forward one more day in its patient calendar. The third day begins with a frost so fine and white that it covers every surface of the common like a layer of powdered sugar, and when you step out of the shed, the cold seizes the inside of your nose and makes your eyes water before you have taken 3 steps. The fire takes longer to catch this morning because the kindling has absorbed moisture from the night air, and you spend several minutes crouched over the hearth blowing gently on the tiny spark until it deigns to become a flame. The routine of these small struggles is not frustrating but rather comforting in its familiarity. The same way the stiffness in your shoulders from yesterday's scraping is a comfort because it proves that the work is real and progressing. You eat your bread standing up, watching the sky lighten from black to deep grey to a pale silver that promises no sun but at least offers enough illumination to work by. And then you gather your tools and walk the now familiar path to the dovecote door. Inside, the birds have already begun their day, and the air is full of the sound of wings. As pigeons come and go through the high opening, their grey bodies appearing and disappearing against the pale rectangle of sky. The floor where you scraped yesterday has settled a little overnight, the exposed darker earth drying slightly at the surface to form a thin crust of its own that crackles when you step on it. You set the bucket down in the center of the cleared patch and take up the rake, turning to face the next section of untouched crust that curves away to your left along the base of the wall. This is the real beginning of the work now, the first full day of scraping after the initial exploration, and you feel your body settling into the posture that it will hold for the weeks ahead. Knees slightly bent, back curved forward from the hips, arms moving in the short repeated arcs that pull the rake through the grey-white surface. The crust in this section is thicker than the patch you cleared yesterday, having accumulated against the wall where a projecting stone ledge creates a sheltered roost that the birds favor above all others. Directly beneath this ledge, the droppings have built up into a solid dome that rises nearly to your knee, its surface pocked and dimpled like old mortar. You begin at the outer edge of this dome and work inward, using the rake to break off pieces the size of your fist, each one releasing a puff of fine grey dust that catches in your throat and makes you cough once into your sleeve. The material comes away in layers that reveal their history as you work deeper. A thin band of loose feathers marks a molting season. A darker streak of compressed droppings indicates a wet spring when the birds stayed longer in the tower, and buried at the very center of the dome is a small round stone that a pigeon must have swallowed and then regurgitated, its surface worn smooth by the acids of the bird's crop. You pause now and then to gather the loosened material into the bucket, using your hands to scoop up the finer powder and the smaller fragments, and each time you do this the bucket grows a little heavier, and the pile inside the trough back at the shed grows a little larger in your mind. The work is repetitive in the way that all good work is repetitive, each stroke of the rake following the last without variation, and this sameness allows your thoughts to drift away from the present moment into a kind of quiet emptiness that is neither awake nor asleep, but somewhere pleasantly between. You think about the shape of the dovecote and the way the walls curve inward as they rise, about the number of birds that have lived and died inside this tower since it was built, about the hands that laid the stones and mixed the mortar and cut the timbers for the roof. These thoughts did not lead anywhere, and that is exactly why they are so restful. After 2 hours of steady scraping, you have cleared a second patch of floor roughly equal in size to the first, and the bucket is full enough that the weight of it strains the handle when you lift it. You carry it outside and across the common to the shed, walking slowly so that none of the precious earth spills over the rim, and when you tip it into the trough, you see that the pile has grown substantially overnight, as if the earth itself has been multiplying in the dark. You take up the paddle and break down the fresh material, mixing it loosely with yesterday's accumulation, and the combined scent of so much disturbed earth rises up strong enough that you step back for a moment to let the air clear. The ammonia smell is sharper today, perhaps because the new material comes from deeper in the crust, where the nitrates are more concentrated, and you make a mental note to begin the mixing with wood ashes sooner than you had planned, since the raw earth should not be left to sit too long or it will lose some of its potency to the open air. Back at the dovecote, the morning has advanced enough that a weak light is now falling directly through the high opening, casting a pale shaft of illumination onto the floor that moves almost imperceptibly as the sun travels behind the clouds. The pigeons have grown accustomed to your presence and no longer stir when you enter, merely watching you with their orange-ringed eyes as you cross to the next section of uncleared crust. This section lies directly beneath the opening, and the material here has a different character from the wall accumulations, having been repeatedly wetted by rain and then dried by the wind that circulates through the tower. It is harder and more compact, requiring you to use the corner of the rake like a chisel to break it into manageable pieces, and the sound it makes under the iron is a sharp crack rather than the soft scrape you have grown used to. You work more slowly here, taking care not to damage the underlying earth that holds the richest concentration of nitrates, and as you work, you notice for the first time the fine tracery of cracks that spread across the hardened surface like the veins in an old leaf. By midday, the light has shifted so that the shaft from the high opening now falls on the far wall, illuminating the row of nest holes directly opposite, and you can see clearly into several of them, little dark pockets lined with twigs and scraps of dried grass. In one of the holes, a pigeon is sitting on a nest, its body perfectly still, except for the tiny movements of its throat as it breathes. And on the ledge just below it, a second bird preens its wing feathers with a beak that moves in quick, precise darts. You stop scraping for a moment and watch them, leaning on the handle of the rake and feeling the ache in your lower back begin to fade as your spine straightens. The birds have been here longer than you, longer than the village, longer perhaps than any human memory of this place, and their calm indifference to your presence is a reminder that the dovecote belongs to them first and to the saltpeter man only by temporary arrangement. The afternoon passes in the same slow pattern, the bucket filling and emptying, the cleared area growing by steady increments, and the birds wheeling in and out of the high opening in groups of 3 and 4. You lose count of the number of trips you make to the shed, but at some point you notice that the trough is now more than half full, and that the pile of raw earth rises well above the sides, a small mountain of grey and brown and white that holds within it the potential for many pounds of pure saltpeter. The thought is satisfying in a quiet way, the same satisfaction you might feel at seeing a woodshed filled with split logs or a pantry stocked with jars of preserved fruit. The winter will be long and cold, but the trough is filling and the leaching pit will soon be ready to receive its first charge of mixed earth and ash. When the light begins to fail for the 3rd time since you arrived at the village, you make one final trip to the dovecote and stand in the doorway looking at the work you have done. The cleared area now extends along a full half of the wall's circumference, a wide band of exposed dark earth that contrasts sharply with the remaining crust, and the boundary between the two is a clean line that curves gently from the door to the far side of the tower. The remaining crust covers the other half of the floor in an unbroken sheet of grey-white, and you estimate that it will take perhaps another 4 or 5 days to clear it all, assuming the weather holds and the cold does not deepen so much that the crust freezes solid. Beyond that, you will need to scrape down into the darker underlayer itself, which will yield richer material but will require more care to avoid digging too deep and mixing the good earth with the sterile soil beneath. You close the dovecote door and walk back to the shed in the gathering dusk. Your footprints from the morning now frozen into hard casts that crunch under your boots. The fire is still blowing beneath its coating of ash, and you stir it back to life with a few sticks and a gentle breath. The warmth spreads across your face and hands, and you sit on the stool with your legs stretched out before you, letting the day's tiredness settle into your muscles. Outside the common is quiet, except for the distant murmur of the brook, which has not yet frozen over entirely and still makes a faint liquid sound beneath its lid of ice. The village is invisible in the darkness, but you can smell the smoke from its chimneys and occasionally hear the lowing of a cow from the byre behind the inn. You think about the work that remains before you can begin the next stage of the process. The trough must be filled completely, which means several more days of scraping and carrying. Then the wood ashes must be mixed in at the proper ratio, 1 measure of ash to 4 measure of ash, and the whole mass must be stirred until it is uniform in color and texture. After that, the leaching pit must be charged with the mixture, and the first buckets of water must be drawn from the brook and poured through it, and the slow drip from the spigot must be collected in the copper pan. Each of these steps will take time, and none of them can be hurried, because the chemistry of nitre extraction obeys its own laws and will not be rushed by human impatience. You have learned this lesson before in other winters and other dovecotes, and you accept it now with the same calm that you accept the cold and the short days and the long nights. You eat your bread and drink your water, and then you bank the fire carefully so that it will keep its coals alive until morning. The bedroll is cold when you first slide into it, but your body warms it quickly, and soon you are floating in that comfortable space between waking and sleep where the outlines of the day's work blur into soft shapes. The dovecote stands dark and silent on its rise, the birds tucked into their holes, the half-scraped floor waiting for tomorrow's labor, and the whole small world of the common wrapped in the thick quiet of the winter night. Your hands still smell faintly of ammonia, and your shoulders still carry the memory of the rake's motion, and these sensations follow you down into sleep like a lullaby made of ordinary things. The bucket is full for the first time on a morning when the snow has stopped falling and the air has turned so still that you can hear the sound of a single crow calling from somewhere beyond the brook, a sound that seems to come from very far away, even though the bird is probably perched in the ash tree, not 50 paces from the dovecote door. You straighten your back and feel the vertebrae click softly into place, and then you reach down and take the handle of the bucket in both hands, testing its weight before you lift it clear of the scraped earth. The bucket is not so heavy that you cannot carry it with one hand for short distances, but the path to the shed is 27 paces of uneven ground covered in snow that has not yet been trodden flat, so you decide to use both hands and keep the load balanced in front of you where you can watch for any spillage. The raw earth inside the bucket is a mixture of grey crust fragments and darker underlayer soil, and it shifts slightly as you lift it, settling into a more compact mass with a soft rustling sound like dry leaves. You step out of the dovecote and the cold wraps around you immediately, the air so clean and sharp that it feels like breathing thin glass. The common spreads before you in a sheet of unbroken white, the snow lying in smooth curves that follow the gentle rolls of the ground, and the shed at the far edge is a dark shape against the pale sky, its thatch roof dusted with a fresh layer of powder. You begin to walk, and each step sinks into the snow to a depth of perhaps 3 inches, your boot leaving a clear print that fills immediately with a tiny pool of blue shadow. The snow muffles every sound, so that the crunch of your footsteps is soft and distant, as if someone else were walking alongside you at a great remove. You count the paces without meaning to, a habit left over from other winters and other paths, and by the time you reach 10 you have already settled into the rhythm of the walk, your body swaying slightly to compensate for the weight of the bucket. At the shed you set the bucket down on the packed earth floor next to the trough and pause for a moment to let your arms recover. The fire is burning low in its ring of stones, and the warmth of it reaches you even here at the edge of the shelter. A faint reminder that the day will eventually end and you will sit beside the flames again. You tip the bucket carefully, using one hand to guide the flow of earth into the trough, and the material slides out in a smooth cascade of grey and brown, dust rising briefly before settling onto the wooden sides. The pile in the trough is now large enough that you can see its shape from across the shed, a low mound that rises above the rim at the center, and you take a moment to break up a few larger clods with the paddle before you turn and pick up the empty bucket for the return journey. The walk back to the dovecote is faster because the bucket weighs almost nothing now, swinging easily from your hand, and you can take longer strides that eat up the distance without effort. The path you made on the outward journey is already visible as a line of darker snow where your footprints have compressed the surface, and you follow it automatically, seeing the way your toes have pointed slightly outward on each step. The dovecote waits for you with its doors standing open, the interior darkness welcoming and familiar, and as you step inside the smell of ammonia rises to greet you like an old friend. You set the empty bucket down in the center of the cleared area and take up the rake again, and the work of scraping resumes exactly where you left it, as if the walk to the shed had been only a brief interruption in a single continuous motion. The second bucket fills more slowly than the first, because you are scraping now from a section of crust that has become harder and more compacted near the base of the wall, where generations of birds have pressed the droppings into a dense grey layer that must be chipped away piece by piece. You work patiently, using the corner of the rake to score lines across the surface, and then prying up the loosened fragments with the flat of the tines. The sound of iron on compacted earth is a low scraping that echoes off the stone walls and mixes with the constant cooing of the birds above. A few pigeons have come down to the floor while you work, hopping along the edge of the uncleared crust and pecking at small seeds that have somehow survived in the accumulated material. They ignore you completely, and you ignore them in return, the two species going about their separate business in the shared space of the tower. When the second bucket is full, you lift it and begin the walk to the shed for the second time. And this time, the path is already easier because your earlier footprints have compressed the snow into a firmer surface that holds your weight without sinking. The 27 paces feel shorter on the second trip. The landmarks more familiar. The small hummock of frozen grass at pace 7. The patch of bare ground at pace 14, where the snow has melted against a buried stone. The slight dip at pace 21, where the ground sloped toward the brook. You notice these features without consciously looking for them. The way you notice the furniture in a room you have lived in for many years, and by the time you reach the shed you have already begun to think of the path as a known thing, a connection between the two poles of your winter world. At the shed you empty the bucket again, adding the new earth to the growing pile, and then you stop for a moment to drink a cup of water from the pan you left warming by the fire. The water is not hot, but it is warmer than the air, and it eases the dryness in your throat that the ammoniac dust has left behind. You look out across the common and see the path you have made, 2 lines of footprints running parallel between the shed and the dovecote, the outward track slightly deeper because of the weight of the full bucket. The sight is pleasing in a quiet way, the evidence of work made visible on the blank page of the snow, and you finish your water and pick up the bucket for the third trip of the morning. The third trip is the one where your body begins to learn the path at a deeper level, the muscles of your legs adjusting to the slight variations in the ground, without any need for conscious direction. Your feet find the compressed footprints of the earlier trips and settle into them with a precision that surprises you, each step landing exactly where the snow is already packed, so that the path becomes more defined with every journey. The bucket is heavier this time because you have scraped from a particularly rich section of the floor, the earth dark and moist and dense with nitrates, and you shift your grip on the handle as you walk, alternating hands every 10 paces to spread the strain evenly. The cold air burns pleasantly in your lungs, and the rhythm of your footsteps establishes itself as a slow, steady beat that matches the beating of your heart, a quiet duet of motion and pulse. By the time you have made 6 trips, the morning has advanced well into the afternoon, and the path between the dovecote and the shed has become a clear feature of the landscape, a narrow track of grey packed snow that winds across the white common like a line drawn with a steady hand. The snow around the path is still untouched and pristine, and the contrast between the smooth white and the trampled grey is sharp enough that you can see the path from the dovecote door even in the fading light. You stop counting the trips now, because the number no longer matters, and instead you simply carry each bucket when it is full and return with it empty, the cycle repeating itself as naturally as breathing. The pile in the trough has grown until it spills over the sides in small avalanches of grey powder, and you've had to use the paddle several times to push the material back into a stable heap. On the 7th trip, you notice that the path has begun to develop a character of its own. The footprints no longer separate, but merged into a continuous channel of compressed snow that holds the shape of your boots in a long repeating pattern. The surface of the path is slightly lower than the surrounding snow because each step presses it down a little further, and in places where the ground beneath is uneven, the path dips and rises in gentle undulations that you have learned to anticipate. You walk with your head up now, not needing to watch your feet, and your gaze wanders across the common to the bare branches of the ash tree, to the distant roofs of the village, to the slow flight of a pigeon making its way back to the dovecote with something held in its beak. The carrying has become a kind of rest, a space between the scraping and the emptying where your body moves without thought and your mind drifts free. The 8th trip is the one where you notice the sound of the snow under your boots has changed. The soft crunch of the first warps has given way to a firmer, more solid sound, almost a squeak, as the packed snow compresses further under your weight. The temperature has dropped a little since the morning, and the surface of the path is beginning to freeze into a harder consistency that will hold its shape even if more snow falls tonight. You think about this with a mild satisfaction, because a frozen path is easier to walk on and will save you the effort of breaking a new trail each morning. The work is easier when the path is established and the winter is long, and anything that makes the days pass more smoothly is a small gift worth accepting. On the 9th trip, you meet the village dog that watched you on your first arrival, a medium-sized creature of indeterminate breed, with a thick grey coat and a tail that curls over its back. It is standing at the edge of the common, where the lane comes up from the village, and it watches you with the same blank patience it showed before, making no move to approach or to retreat. You nod at it as you pass, and it blinks once, slowly, and then turns and trots back toward the houses, its paws leaving a trail of small neat prints in the fresh snow. The encounter is so brief and so uneventful that it barely registers as an interruption, just one more small detail added to the texture of the day. The 10th trip is when the path becomes automatic in the truest sense, your feet finding the way without any conscious instruction from your brain, as if your legs had learned the 27 paces by heart and could repeat them forever without tiring. You find yourself thinking about other things while you walk, the proper ratio of ash to earth you will mix tomorrow, the depth of the leaching pit, the likelihood that the brook will freeze completely before the month is out, and you will have to melt snow for the water. These thoughts drift through your mind like clouds crossing a still sky, and they leave no trace behind them. Just the quiet hum of a mind at rest in a body at work. By the 12th trip, the afternoon is drawing toward its close, and the light has taken on the deep blue-grey cast that comes just before dusk in the winter months. The dovecote has become a silhouette against the sky, its round roof a dark curve that seems to hold the last of the daylight in its outline. You carry the bucket across the path for the final time today, and your feet know every inch of the way now, every dip and rise, every patch of harder snow, every pace where a stone lurks beneath the surface. The 27 paces feel as familiar as the layout of your own home, and you walk them with the easy confidence of long practice, the full bucket steady in your hands. At the shed, you empty the final bucket and take stock of the day's work. The trough is now almost completely full, the pile of raw earth rising in a broad cone that reaches nearly to the level of your chest. You have carried 12 buckets today, each one weighing perhaps 30 pounds, which means you have moved roughly 360 pounds of dovecote earth across the 27 paces of the path. The distance is small, but the repetition is the point, the steady accumulation of material one bucket at a time, and you are satisfied with the progress. Tomorrow you will begin the mixing with wood ashes, and the work will enter its next phase, but for tonight there is nothing more to do except rest. You sit on the stool by the fire and hold your hands out to the flames, feeling the warmth seep into your fingers and travel slowly up your arms. Your legs ache faintly from the repeated walking, and your shoulders carry the memory of the bucket's weight, but the aches are mild and familiar, the kind of tiredness that comes from steady work rather than from strain. You look out at the path you have made, visible now as a dark line across the pale snow, and you think about how many more times you will walk it before the winter is over. Hundreds of trips, perhaps thousands, each one identical to the last, and each one carrying the dovecote's slow gift from the darkness of the tower to the waiting trough. The thought is not daunting, but rather comforting, the way a long straight road is comforting, because you can see exactly where you are going, and exactly how long it will take to get there. The coals shift in the hearth, and a small flame leaps up for a moment, illuminating the underside of the thatch and the rough poles of the roof. Outside, the darkness has settled completely over the common, and the path is no longer visible except as a faint depression in the snow, a suggestion of a line rather than the line itself. The dovecote is a black mass against the black sky, and the birds are quiet now, sleeping in their rows of stone alcoves. You eat your bread slowly, chewing each mouthful many times, and you drink the last of the warm water from the pan. The day has been nothing but the scraping of the rake and the carrying of the bucket and the slow creation of a path in the snow, and it has been exactly enough. Before you lie down for the night, you step outside one last time and look up at the sky, which has cleared enough to show a few stars scattered across the darkness like grains of salt spilled on a black cloth. The air is colder than ever, and the path beneath your feet is frozen solid now, a hard grey ribbon that will be there waiting for you in the morning. You breathe in the sharp, clean air and let it out slowly, watching the plume of your breath rise and disappear, and then you go back inside the shed and pull the door covering closed. The blanket is cold at first, but it warms quickly, and you lie in the darkness listening to the small sounds of the night, the creak of a branch, the distant murmur of the brook beneath its ice, the soft rustle of the thatch as the breeze moves across it. The path from the dovecote to the shed is fixed now in the snow and in your body, and you will walk it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, each trip a perfect repetition of the one before, the carrying of the raw earth continuing as steadily as the turning of the earth itself. The morning you begin the mixing is indistinguishable from the mornings that came before it, except for a single detail, the barrel of wood ashes that has stood untouched against the back wall of the shed since the day you arrived is now the center of your attention, its rough oak staves and iron hoops suddenly as important as the rake or the bucket or the path you have worn into the snow. You wake with the knowledge that the first stage of the work is complete, that the trough holds enough raw dovecote earth to fill the leaching pit, and that today you will begin the slow transformation of that earth into something that will yield its nitrates to water and fire. The fire catches more easily this morning because you remembered to cover the kindling with a piece of sacking overnight, and you sit for a while with your hands around a cup of warm water, looking at the ash barrel and thinking about the proportions you will need to observe. Wood ash is not simply wood ash, and you have learned over many winters to judge its quality by sight and touch before you commit it to the mixture. The barrel was filled by the charcoal burner who works in the forest beyond the village, and his ash is always good, made from hardwoods burned slowly in covered pits where the combustion is starved of air and the resulting powder is fine and grey-white with a slight bluish cast. You prise open the wooden lid of the barrel and scoop out a handful, letting it sift through your fingers onto a flat stone beside the hearth. The ash is light and soft, almost silky, and it leaves a pale stain on your palm that does not wash off easily. The smell is clean and mineral, with no trace of char or smoke, which tells you that the burning was complete and the carbon has all been consumed. This is the ash you need, because carbon in the mixture would attract impurities during the leaching and spoil the final crystallization. The ratio is fixed and immutable, 1 part ash to 4 parts earth. You have carried this number in your head for so many years that it has become a part of your thinking, as natural as the number of paces to the dovecote or the number of sticks needed to boil a pan of liquid. To measure the earth, you use a simple wooden box that holds exactly 1 gallon when filled level to the brim. A box you found in the shed on your first day and recognized as the saltpeter man's measure by the dark stains worked into its grain. You set this box beside the trough and begin to fill it, scooping the raw earth from the pile with your hands and pressing it gently into the corners so that the measure is true. Each gallon of earth weighs perhaps 6 or 7 pounds depending on how much moisture it holds, and the trough holds many gallons, so the measuring will take a good part of the morning. You fall into the rhythm of it, without thinking, scoop and fill, the box growing heavy in your hands, and then light again as you tip its contents into a second trough that you have cleaned and set aside for the mixing. The raw earth pours out in a steady stream, the grey crust fragments and darker soil mingling together, and the pile in the second trough begins to rise in a shape that mirrors the first. Every 4th boxful, you pause and turn to the ash barrel. And here the measuring is different because the ash is so light that a gallon of it weighs less than 2 pounds and tends to fly up into the air if you pour it too quickly. You use a smaller scoop for the ash, a tin cup that holds exactly 1/4 of a gallon, and you add 4 cupfuls of ash to each gallon of earth, tapping the cup against the rim of the barrel to settle the powder before you transfer it. The ash falls onto the pile of earth in soft, pale drifts that slide down the sides and settle into the crevices between the darker fragments. After you have measured out 8 gallons of earth and 2 gallons of ash, a small mountain of mixed ingredients stands in the second trough waiting for the paddle, and you pause to roll up your sleeves and tighten the scarf around your neck. The shed is cold, but your body is warm from the work, and the fire crackles quietly in its ring of stones, sending a thin line of smoke up into the thatch. You take up the paddle, a flat wooden blade fixed to a long handle, and you begin to stir the mixture with long, slow strokes that start at the outer edge of the pile and work gradually inward. The paddle moves through the earth and ash with a soft rustling sound, and as it moves it blends the 2 colors together, the grey-white of the ash disappearing gradually into the darker grey-brown of the dovecote earth, until the whole mass begins to take on a uniform shade that is lighter and drier than the raw earth alone. The chemistry of what you are doing is simple and ancient, a process that has been known to saltpeter men for centuries and probably to alchemists long before them. The potassium carbonate in the wood ash, which is the white powder that gives the ash its silky feel, will combine with the calcium nitrate in the dovecote earth when water is added, exchanging their partners in a slow invisible dance that produces calcium carbonate, which will remain behind as a waste solid, and potassium nitrate, which is the saltpeter you seek and which will dissolve into the water and can be carried away and crystallized. You do not think about this chemistry in words while you work, because the knowledge has become bodily rather than intellectual, a sense of rightness that comes from the color and texture of the mixture rather than from any remembered formula. When the mix looks right, you know it is right, just as you know when bread dough has been kneaded enough or when a fire needs another stick. After the first batch is thoroughly blended, you scoop it out of the mixing trough with a flat shovel and carry it across the shed to the leaching pit, where you tip it in and spread it evenly over the bottom with the back of the shovel. The leaching pit is a rectangular hole dug into the earth and lined with a thick layer of puddled clay that has been smoothed and fired with a slow heat until it is almost as hard as pottery. It is about 3 feet long, 2 feet wide and 2 feet deep, with a slight slope toward the end where the wooden spigot is set into the clay wall. The spigot is a simple tap made of a hollowed branch fitted with a wooden plug, and beneath it sits the wide copper pan that will catch the first drippings of nitre-rich liquid. The pit is empty now and waiting, its clay walls pale and smooth in the dim light, and the mixed earth and ash that you pour into it makes a soft pattering sound as it strikes the bottom. You return to the measuring and the mixing and the carrying, and the morning passes in a succession of these small actions that link together into a single continuous motion. The second batch is measured and mixed just as the first was. 4 gallons of earth to 1 gallon of ash, stirred until the color is uniform and the texture is loose and crumbly, and then carried to the pit and spread over the first layer. The third batch follows, and then the fourth, and with each addition the pit fills a little more, the layers building up like the strata in the dovecote floor, each one a record of the work that produced it. You begin to feel the familiar ache in your arms from the repeated stirring, and you pause now and then to shake out your hands and roll your shoulders, small gestures that have become part of the day's pattern. By the time the 5th batch is ready, the pit is nearly half full, and you stop for a moment to look at what you have done. The surface of the mixture is flat and smooth where you have leveled it with the shovel, and it gives off a smell that is different from both the raw earth and the ash alone. A cleaner and more neutral scent that suggests the chemistry has already begun to work. The potassium carbonate meeting the calcium nitrate in the thin film of moisture that clings to every particle. You press your palm gently onto the surface and feel the coolness of it, the slight give of the loose material, and you note with satisfaction that the mixture is holding together without being wet, a sign that the proportions are correct and the leaching will proceed evenly. Outside the shed the day has brightened a little, the grey sky lightening to a pale silver that makes the snow glare painfully if you look at it too long. You step out for a moment to breathe the fresh air and to stretch your legs, and you notice that the path to the dovecote has been crossed by a line of bird tracks, small 3-toed prints that wander across the packed snow and then veer off toward the brook. The dovecote itself looks smaller from here, its round shape dwarfed by the wide white expanse of the common, and you can see a few pigeons circling high above it, their wings catching the pale light as they turn. The cold is deep but still, and the only sound is the distant murmur of the village waking into its midday routines. You stand for a minute or two, letting the silence settle into your bones, and then you turn and go back into the shed where the work is waiting. The 6th batch requires you to climb into the barrel of ash with the scoop to reach the last of the powder at the bottom, and you do this carefully, stepping over the rim and crouching inside the narrow space while the oak staves creak under your weight. The ash at the bottom is finer than the rest, almost like flour, and it rises in a pale cloud when you disturb it, coating your hands and the front of your coat with a thin white film. You scoop it out in careful cupfuls and pass them over the rim to yourself, and then you climb out again and measure the last of the earth from the first trough. The pile of raw material that took so many days to accumulate has now been reduced to a thin scattering of crumbs at the bottom of the trough, and you scrape these up with the edge of the paddle and add them to the final batch. The transformation from raw earth to prepared mixture is a kind of closing, a completion of one phase, and you feel the quiet satisfaction of it as you stir the last batch with the paddle, watching the ash swirl into the earth and disappear. When the final batch has been carried to the pit and spread over the top, the pit is full to within a few inches of the rim, a level bed of grey-brown material that looks almost like fine gravel. You tamp it down gently with the flat of the shovel, not too hard, just enough to settle the particles and eliminate any large air pockets that might cause the water to channel through unevenly. The surface is smooth and even, sloping slightly toward the spigot end, and you run your hand over it one last time to check for any loose patches. The mixture feels cool and dry and slightly gritty under your palm, and it has a clean mineral smell that reminds you of damp stone in a cellar. You clean the paddle and the scoop and the measure box, wiping them down with a rag and setting them in their places against the wall of the shed. The empty ash barrel you roll outside and leave beside the woodpile, where it will serve as a container for something else before the winter is out. The first trough is empty now except for a faint grey stain on the wood, and you turn it over and tap the bottom to knock out any remaining dust. The shed feels different with the mixing done, quieter and more orderly, the centre of activity shifting from the trough to the leaching pit. You build up the fire and set a fresh pan of water over it to warm, and you sit on the stool and eat a piece of bread and a strip of dried meat while you look at the full pit and think about the next stage. The leaching will require a great deal of water, and the brook is already half frozen, its surface a lattice of ice crystals that thicken each night. You will need to break through the ice with a stone and dip your buckets into the cold black water beneath, and then you will need to carry those buckets across the snow and pour them carefully over the mixture in the pit. The water will sink downward through the layers, dissolving the potassium nitrate as it goes and carrying it toward the spigot, where it will emerge as a brownish liquid that must be collected and boiled. The first pouring will be the most important, because it will saturate the mixture and begin the slow journey of the nitrates from the solid earth into the liquid solution. And you must be careful not to pour too quickly, or the water will find a single path through the material and leave the rest untouched. You sit with these thoughts while the afternoon advances outside, the light growing steadily dimmer and the cold pressing harder against the walls of the shed. The fire pops and a spark flies out and dies on the earthen floor, and you sweep it back with the edge of your boot. Your body is tired in a way that feels good, the muscles of your arms and shoulders pleasantly heavy from the stirring and the lifting, and your stomach is full of bread and meat and warm water. The pit waits in the corner of the shed, its load of mixed earth and ash dark and still, and tomorrow you will wake and carry the first buckets of water from the brook and begin the long, slow process of washing the nitrates out of the earth. Tonight there is nothing more to do, and so you bank the fire carefully and spread your bedroll over the straw, and you lie down in the warmth of the fading flames and let the day's work dissolve into the quiet of the evening. The smell of wood ash lingers on your hands and in the fabric of your coat, a clean, dry scent that follows you down into sleep. Outside the dovecote stands in the darkness, with its cargo of pigeons and its slowly renewing floor, and the path you have worn across the common is frozen hard and waiting for tomorrow's footsteps. You have mixed the earth and the ash in the correct proportion, 4:1, and you have filled the leaching pit, and you have done everything that the day required of you. The rest belongs to the water and the fire, and the slow chemistry that works its changes in the dark, and you let it all go as your breathing slows and the last glow of the coals fades to black. The water you need is waiting in the brook at the bottom of the common, a narrow stream that runs between low banks of frozen mud and withered sedge. And on the morning you begin the leaching, you wake with the knowledge that the first bucket must be drawn before the day warms enough to soften the ice and make the banks slippery underfoot. You eat your bread quickly, standing in the doorway of the shed with the cold air sharp against your face, and then you take up the 2 wooden buckets that have been waiting against the wall and begin the walk down to the brook along a path that is not yet a path. The snow here still untouched except for the wandering prints of birds and the deep round holes left by a fox moving across the common in the night. The buckets bump gently against your legs as you walk, and the handles creak with a sound that is already familiar even though you have not carried them before, the same way all wooden things creak when they are cold and dry and newly woken to their purpose. The brook, when you reach it, is a dark seam of moving water visible through a lid of ice that covers the surface from bank to bank. The ice thickest at the edges, where it is frozen solid against the mud, and thinner in the center, where the current runs faster and keeps the water open in a narrow, winding channel. You set the buckets down and look for a place where the ice is thin enough to break, finding it near a half-submerged stone that the flowing water has kept partly clear. A dark patch of liquid that steams faintly in the cold air because the water is warmer than the atmosphere above it. Kneeling on the frozen bank with one hand braced against a tuft of stiff grass, you lean out and strike the edge of the ice with a stone you have brought from the shed. A single sharp blow that sends a crack running out across the surface in a white branching line. The ice breaks away in jagged pieces that you push aside with the stone, clearing a hole large enough to dip a bucket, and the sound of the water is suddenly louder, a soft gurgling that had been muffled by the frozen lid. You lower the first bucket into the hole and let it fill slowly, feeling the weight increase as the water pours in over the wooden rim, the bucket sinking deeper until it is full and heavy, and you must use both hands to lift it back onto the bank. The water is clear and cold and carries a few small fragments of ice that swirl in the current you have made, and you set the full bucket aside and fill the second one in the same way, lowering and lifting, the motion already becoming part of the day's rhythm. When both buckets are full, you pick them up and begin the walk back to the shed, each bucket weighing perhaps 40 pounds, the weight pulling at your arms and shoulders in a way that reminds you of the first days of carrying the raw earth from the dovecote. The path back is now marked by your outward footprints, and you follow them automatically, the water sloshing gently against the sides of the buckets and occasionally spilling a few drops that freeze almost instantly on the packed snow. At the shed, you set the buckets down beside the leaching pit and pause for a moment to let your arms recover, shaking out your hands and rolling your shoulders in slow circles. The pit is full of the mixture you prepared yesterday, its surface smooth and level and slightly domed where you tamped it down with a shovel, and it waits with a kind of patience that seems almost alive, a readiness to receive the water and begin its slow transformation. You look at the pit and then at the buckets, and then at the copper pan that sits beneath the spigot, and you feel the moment as a kind of threshold, the point where the work changes from the dry handling of earth and ash to the wet chemistry of dissolution and flow. There is no hurry in this feeling, only a quiet recognition that the next stage is beginning and that you are ready for it. The first pour is the one that matters most, and you take up a smaller vessel, a wooden ladle with a long handle that you found among the tools on your first day, and you dip it into the first bucket and carry a measure of water to the pit. Instead of pouring it all in one place, which might cut a channel through the mixture and leave the rest untouched, you sprinkle it gently over the surface in a slow back and forth motion, the water falling from the ladle in a thin stream that darkens the grey-brown material where it lands. The mixture drinks the water immediately, the color changing from pale grey to dark brown as the moisture soaks into the particles and a faint hiss of air being displaced rises from the surface, a sound so soft that it is almost not a sound at all, but a texture in the silence. You continue to ladle water over the surface, moving in a steady pattern from the high end to the low end, and the mixture darkens in a wave that follows the motion of your hand. After half the first bucket has been poured, the surface of the pit has turned uniformly dark, and you can see the water beginning to move downward through the layers, its progress visible as a slight settling of the material and an occasional bubble that rises slowly to the surface and pops with a tiny wet sound. The smell of the pit has changed, the clean mineral scent of the dry mixture giving way to something earthier and more complex, a smell like wet stone and old leaves and the sharp note of nitrates beginning to dissolve. You set the ladle aside and pour the rest of the first bucket directly from the rim, still moving in that slow back and forth pattern, and the water pools briefly on the surface, before being absorbed, the level of the mixture sinking slightly as the liquid fills the spaces between the particles and begins its journey toward the bottom of the pit. The second bucket you pour more slowly, pausing between each tilt of the bucket to watch the water disappear, and by the time it is empty, the pit has reached what you know from experience is the saturation point, the moment when the mixture can hold no more water in suspension and the excess begins to travel downward under its own weight. You set the empty bucket aside and kneel beside the pit, placing your hand flat on the dark wet surface and feeling the cool moisture against your palm. The material is firm and cohesive now, no longer loose and crumbly like the dry mixture, and when you press down gently you can feel the water moving beneath your pressure. A subtle shift that tells you the column of liquid is working its way through the layers toward the clay floor and the waiting spigot. You build up the fire while you wait, adding 3 sticks of hazel and 1 larger piece of alder, and you set the copper pan more squarely beneath the spigot, adjusting its position so that the first drops will fall exactly into the center. The waiting is part of the work, and you do not mind it. Sitting on the stool with your hands stretched toward the flames while the water you have poured makes its slow passage through the packed earth and ash. The chemistry is invisible, but you can picture it clearly in your mind. The potassium carbonate from the wood ash meeting the calcium nitrate from the dovecote earth in the film of water that coats every grain. The ions exchanging partners in a silent dance, the new potassium nitrate dissolving into the water while the calcium carbonate precipitates out as a fine white sludge that will remain behind when the leaching is complete. The water moving downward is no longer just water, but a solution, a carrier of dissolved nitrates that grows stronger as it passes through each successive layer. The first sign that the liquid has reached the bottom of the pit is a darkening of the clay around the spigot, a damp patch that spreads outward from the wooden plug like a shadow. You watch this patch grow from the size of a coin to the size of your palm, and then you see a single bead of liquid form at the tip of the spigot, a round amber drop that hangs there for a long moment before falling into the copper pan with a sound so small and precise that it seems to mark the beginning of a new rhythm. A slow heartbeat of the earth giving up its secrets, one drop at a time. The drop is followed by another, and then another, and soon there is a steady drip falling from the spigot, each drop forming and hanging and releasing in a cycle that takes perhaps 3 seconds from start to finish. The liquid is brownish, the color of weak tea, and it carries a faint shimmer of something dissolved, a slight oiliness that catches the firelight when you hold the pan up to look at it. You dip a finger into the collected liquid and touch it to your tongue, and the taste is sharp and bitter and mineral, the unmistakable signature of nitrates in solution. It is not strong yet, this first run, because the water has only begun to work on the mixture. But it is real, and it is proof that the process has started correctly and that the days of scraping and carrying and mixing have not been wasted. You leave the spigot to drip at its own pace and take up the empty buckets for a second trip to the brook. The path is firmer now, your earlier footprints frozen into solid depressions that hold your weight without sinking, and you walk it easily, the empty buckets light in your hands. At the brook, the hole you broke in the ice has already begun to freeze over again, a thin skin of new ice forming across the dark water, and you break it with the stone and fill both buckets and carry them back up the slope to the shed. The dripping has increased slightly while you were gone, the individual drops now merging into a thin, continuous trickle that falls into the pan with a sound like a distant stream, and the level of liquid in the pan has risen to a depth of perhaps half an inch. You pour the fresh water into the pit in the same careful pattern, wetting the surface evenly and watching it darken and settle, and then you return to the brook for a third pair of buckets and a fourth. Each trip adds more water to the column, pushing the liquid that is already inside downward and flushing more nitrates out of the mixture, and the drip from the spigot grows steadily stronger and darker as the morning passes. The color deepens from pale amber to a rich brown, and the taste when you test it is sharper each time, the bitterness of the nitrates becoming so pronounced that it leaves a tingle on your tongue that lasts for several minutes. By midday the copper pan is nearly half full, and you decide to begin the boiling sooner than you had planned because the solution is now strong enough to yield a good crop of crystals. You lift the pan carefully, the liquid sloshing gently against the copper sides, and you set it on the flat stones over the fire, adding more sticks to bring the flames up to a steady heat. The pan is wide and shallow, which will allow the water to evaporate quickly once it reaches the boiling point, and you sit beside it and watch the surface for the first signs of steam. The dripping from the spigot continues while you wait, and you place a second pan beneath it to catch the ongoing flow, a smaller vessel that will fill more slowly but will keep the liquid from being wasted. The water in the brook is cold and the walk to fetch it is long, and the dripping from the spigot is slow. But none of these things matter because the process is working and the nitrates are coming out of the earth, just as they have done in every dovecote and every winter you have known. You sit by the fire and watch the steam begin to rise, and you think about the many hands that have done this work before you. The saltpeter men of other centuries who dug the earth and mixed the ash and poured the water and waited for the drip. And you feel yourself to be part of a chain that stretches back into a past so deep that its origins are lost in the dark of history. The thought is comforting in the way that all thoughts of continuity are comforting, a reminder that the work is larger than you and will continue long after you have moved on to another village and another dovecote and another winter. The steam thickens above the pan and the liquid begins to bubble at the edges. Small silver bubbles that rise and break and rise again, and the sound of the boiling is a low murmur that joins the drip of the spigot and the crackle of the fire and the distant cooing of the pigeons in their tower. The shed is warm now and full of the smell of wood smoke and wet earth and the sharp, clean scent of nitrates, and you sit in the center of it all with your hands resting on your knees and your eyes half closed, letting the morning's work settle into your body, while the next stage prepares itself in the pan over the fire. The water has been drawn and poured, the mixture has been saturated, and the first brown liquid has dripped from the spigot into the copper pan, and everything else will follow in its own time. The pan sits on the flat stones over the fire, and the brown liquid inside it has begun to shiver at the edges. A faint trembling of the surface that sends small ripples chasing each other from one copper wall to the other. You are sitting on the stool with your hands resting loosely on your knees, watching the pan with the patience of someone who has done this many times before and knows that the boiling cannot be hurried any more than the scraping or the carrying or the slow drip from the spigot could be hurried. The fire beneath the pan is a bed of glowing coals with a few small flames licking up around the sides, and you lean forward now and then to add a stick of hazel from the pile beside your foot, placing it carefully so that it catches quickly and burns with a steady yellow flame that wraps itself around the copper bottom. The wood is dry and well seasoned, and it pops softly as it burns, sending a small shower of sparks up into the thatch where they die without sound. The first steam rises as a wisp so faint that you might miss it if you were not watching closely, a thin white thread that uncurls from the center of the liquid and drifts upward before dissolving into the colder air above the pan. More wisps follow, thickening into a steady column of vapor that carries the sharp, clean scent of nitrates into every corner of the shed. A smell that is both mineral and organic, like wet stone and old leaves, and something that reminds you of the sea, although you have never seen the sea. The steam coils upward and meets the cold thatch, where it freezes almost instantly into tiny droplets that hang from the straw ends like 1,000 small beads of water, catching the firelight and glinting before they grow heavy and fall back toward the earth in a fine mist that you feel on your upturned face. As the liquid warms toward the boiling point, small bubbles begin to appear round the inner edge of the pan where the copper is hottest, silvery beads that swell and detach and rise through the brown liquid with a lazy motion. The bubbles make a soft sound, a kind of liquid sigh that is barely audible beneath the crackle of the fire, and you lean closer to watch them, observing the way they cluster together near the sides before breaking free and floating toward the center. The surface of the liquid is no longer still, but alive with the slow convection that rolls the warmer liquid upward and the cooler liquid downward, a gentle circular motion that you can trace by following a single speck of dust as it travels across the pan. The scum begins to form when the liquid reaches a simmer, a grayish foam that gathers first at the edges and then spreads inward in a thin skin that wrinkles and folds as the bubbles push against it from below. This scum is made of impurities that the dissolving water carried with it out of the leaching pit, small particles of organic matter and fine clay and other substances that have no place in the pure saltpeter you are trying to produce. You reach for the flat wooden spoon that rests on the rim of the clay jar beside your foot, a simple utensil carved from a single piece of beechwood that has been darkened by years of use, and you begin to skim the foam from the surface with slow, careful strokes that move from the far edge of the pan toward you. The motion of skimming is a thing you know in your hands and not in your mind, a delicate angle of the spoon that slides just beneath the surface and lifts the foam without taking too much of the liquid with it. You draw the spoon across the pan in a smooth arc, and the greyish scum collects against the flat blade in a soft mound that trembles slightly, holding its shape for a moment before you tip it into the clay jar. The foam makes a faint hissing sound as it leaves the spoon, and it settles in the bottom of the jar in a wet mass that slowly collapses into a thin grey sludge. You wipe the spoon on the edge of the jar and return it to the surface of the liquid, finding another patch of scum already forming where the first was removed. The scum keeps coming as the liquid heats, a continuous production of impurities that rise to the surface on the currents of convection, and you settle into a rhythm of skimming that matches the rhythm of the boiling. Every few minutes you draw the spoon across the surface, and each time you collect a fresh load of foam, and each time you tip it into the jar and wipe the spoon and return to your watching. The work is repetitive, in the way that all good work is repetitive, each motion following the last without variation. And this sameness allows your thoughts to drift into a quiet space where time is measured only by the thickening of the steam and the gradual darkening of the liquid in the pan. While you skim, you also tend the fire, adding a stick of alder when the flames begin to die back, and pushing the coals closer together with the iron poker so that the heat is concentrated beneath the center of the pan. The fire is a living thing that requires small adjustments, and you make these adjustments without thinking, your hands knowing exactly how much wood to add and where to place it, just as your hands know the angle of the spoon and the pressure needed to lift the scum without breaking the surface tension of the liquid. The shed is warm now, warmer than it has been since you arrived, and you have loosened the scarf around your neck and opened the top button of your coat to let the heat reach your chest. The liquid comes to a full boil with a sudden increase in the size and number of the bubbles, a rolling motion that sends steam billowing upward in thick white clouds. The sound of the boiling changes from a soft murmur to a deeper, more insistent noise, a steady churning that fills the shed and drowns out the distant cooing of the pigeons and the whisper of the wind against the walls. You watch the color of the liquid deepen from the pale amber of the first drippings to a richer, darker brown, the color of strong ale or old leather, and you know that this darkening means the solution is becoming more concentrated as the water evaporates and the nitrates remain behind. The skimming changes as the liquid boils harder, the scum becoming thicker and darker, more like a froth than a foam, and you must use the spoon more firmly to push it to the side of the pan, where it collects in a thick rim that you can lift away in one piece. The impurities in this darker scum have a different smell, more organic and faintly unpleasant, and you are glad to remove them from the liquid and drop them into the jar where they can do no harm. The jar fills slowly, the grey sludge rising in layers that record each skimming like the strata in a riverbank, and you pause once to tamp it down with the handle of the spoon so that it will hold more. Outside the shed the afternoon is passing, and you are aware of this only in the way the quality of the light changes against the walls, the grey rectangle of the doorway shifting from pale silver to a deeper slate as the sun moves behind the clouds and the clouds move across the sky. The snow that began falling earlier in the day has stopped, and the common is a smooth white expanse broken only by the path you have worn to the dovecote and the path you have worn to the brook. Two lines of darker snow that meet at the shed and then diverge again like the branches of a river. The dovecote itself is a dark shape against the pale sky, its conical roof white with the new snow, and a few pigeons circle above it in a slow pattern that has no apparent purpose. You return your attention to the pan, where the liquid is now boiled down to a fraction of its original volume, the level dropping steadily as the steam carries the water away. The boiling has become thicker, the bubbles smaller and more numerous, rising through a liquid that is now more syrup than water, and the smell of nitrates is so strong that you can taste it on your tongue. A sharp, bitter tang that cuts through the wood smoke and the cold air. You skim again, the spoon moving more slowly through the thickened liquid, and the scum that rises now is sparse and fine, a thin white film that barely holds together when you lift it. This is the sign that the impurities have mostly been removed, and the liquid is approaching the point where it will be ready to crystallize. You add a few more sticks to the fire and watch the boiling continue, the pan now giving off a constant cloud of steam that rolls upward and freezes in the thatch and drips back down in a fine cold mist that has wet the shoulders of your coat. The afternoon wears on in this way, the pan bubbling and the spoon skimming and the fire crackling, and you lose track of the number of times you have added wood or skimmed scum or adjusted the position of the pan on the stones. The work is a single continuous motion that began when you first poured the water into the leaching pit, and will not end until the saltpeter is dry and packed and ready for the committee's wagon. When the liquid has reduced to perhaps a fifth of its original volume, you notice that the boiling has become quieter, the bubbles rising more slowly through the thickened liquid, and the steam has thinned to a lazy coil that barely reaches the thatch before disappearing. The color of the liquid is now a deep, rich brown, almost black in the center of the pan, and when you lift the spoon and let the liquid drip from it, it falls in slow, heavy drops that stretch into thin strings before breaking. This is the consistency you have been waiting for, the moment when the solution is saturated enough that the nitrates will crystallize readily when the liquid is cooled, and you know that the boiling is nearly finished. You push the pan slightly to one side of the fire so that the heat is less direct, and you let the liquid simmer gently while you skim the last thin film of impurities from the surface. The spoon moves with a slow deliberation, and the scum it collects is almost transparent now, a faint milky residue that barely clings to the wood. You tip this last skim into the jar and wipe the spoon clean on a rag, and then you sit back on the stool and look at the pan with the quiet satisfaction of a task completed. The liquid inside is hot and dark and heavy with dissolved nitrates, and it holds all the labor of the past days, all the scraping and carrying and mixing and leaching, concentrated now into a few inches of steaming brown syrup. You let the fire die down to a bed of glowing coals, and you sit in the warmth and watch the steam rise in thin, lazy threads from the surface of the liquid. The shed is quiet now except for the soft tick of the cooling pan and the distant drip of the spigot still releasing its slow flow into the second pan on the floor. Your body is tired in a way that feels whole and settled, the muscles of your arms and back pleasantly heavy from the long hours of skimming and tending the fire, and your eyes are dry from the steam and the smoke. You close them for a moment and listen to the small sounds of the evening settling over the common, the rustle of the pigeons in the dovecote, the creak of the ash tree in the cold, the faint murmur of the brook beneath its ice. When you open your eyes, the light in the doorway has faded to a deep blue-gray that signals the end of the day, and the fire has burned down to embers that glow a dull red in the darkness. You rise from the stool and stretch your arms above your head, feeling the vertebrae in your spine separate and realign, and then you take up a heavy cloth and fold it several times to protect your hands from the heat of the pan. The pan is still very hot, and you lift it carefully, feeling the weight of the thickened liquid shift as you raise it from the stones. You carry it across the shed and set it on a flat stone near the doorway, where the cold air can begin to reach it, and the copper gives off a faint hiss as it touches the cooler surface. Outside, the snow is blowing faintly with the last light of the sky, and the dovecote stands in its place like a sentinel of the winter, dark and still and patient. Tomorrow you will carry the pan out into the sharp, clean air and watch the crystals form in the cold. But tonight the work is done, and you can rest. The pan has been cooling on the flat stone inside the shed doorway for long enough that the copper no longer hisses when you touch it with a damp finger, though the liquid within still holds a deep warmth that you can feel radiating against your face when you lean close to look at it. The steam has stopped entirely now, and the surface of the concentrated liquor is as still as a dark mirror, reflecting the dull orange glow of the fire embers in a wavering circle that trembles when you breathe. You kneel beside the pan and study it for a moment, noting the way the liquid clings to the copper sides in a thin, syrupy film, the way it has darkened further during its slow cooling to the color of strong black tea held up to a candle flame. Everything is ready, and the cold outside is waiting, and so you fold the heavy cloth several times, grit the handles of the pan firmly through the padded layers, and lift it from the stone with a steady motion that does not disturb the surface of the liquid more than a gentle shiver. The walk from the shed to the ash tree is only 15 paces, but the cold outside is so sharp and sudden after the warmth of the fire that it feels like stepping into a different element, as if the air has turned from gas to liquid between one breath and the next. The pan is heavy, the concentrated liquor sloshing gently against the copper walls, and you walk slowly with your eyes on the ground ahead, placing each foot carefully on the packed snow of the path you have worn between the shed and the dovecote, and now extend by a short spur to the base of the ash tree. The ash tree stands at the edge of the common, where the ground begins to slope down toward the brook, its bare branches spreading against the darkening sky in a pattern that looks like the veins of a leaf held up to the light, and at its base there is a large flat stone that someone placed there long ago, a slab of grey rock worn smooth by weather and sunk deep into the frozen earth. You had chosen this stone because it is level, and because it sits in the full path of the night wind, which will carry away the last warmth from the pan faster than still air ever could. You set the pan down on the flat stone with both hands, taking care that it sits level so the liquid does not pool deeper at one end than the other. And then you straighten up and step back and let the cold begin its work. The contrast between the warm pan and the freezing stone is immediate and visible. A faint wisp of vapor rising from beneath the copper where the heat of the bottom meets the cold of the rock, and you watch this vapor curl upward and dissolve into the still air like a small ghost. The pan itself gleams in the last light of the day, the copper reflecting the pale grey sky and the dark branches above in a distorted miniature that makes the whole scene look like something seen through water. And you pull your coat tight around your neck and settle in to watch the transformation. The first change comes sooner than you expected. A faint cloudiness that begins at the edges of the liquid where the copper is already cold and spreads inward in slow tendrils that reach toward the center, like a pale mist creeping across a field at dawn. The cloudiness is not a solid thing, but a suspension of something invisible. The dissolved saltpeter beginning to come out of solution as the temperature drops and the water can no longer hold it, and you kneel down on the packed snow beside the stone so that your eyes are level with the surface of the liquid, and you can watch the process unfold at close range. The cold of the ground seeps through the knees of your trousers almost immediately, but you ignore it because the sight before you is the quiet culmination of everything you've done since you arrived at the village. The cloud thickens from a faint mist to a definite milkiness that swirls gently in the convection currents of the still cooling liquid, tiny particles of solid matter winking in and out of visibility as they move through the solution. You can see individual points of light catching on something crystalline, and then quite suddenly the first needles appear, so fine and white and slender that they look like hairs or threads of glass, barely visible against the dark background of the liquid. They form at the very edge of the pan first, where the copper is coldest, and they grow outward into the liquid in straight lines that cross each other at angles, creating a delicate lattice that spreads across the surface with a speed that is almost too slow to watch, but that accumulates moment by moment into something unmistakable. Each needle is a crystal of pure potassium nitrate, the substance you have worked to extract from the earth of the dovecote, and each one is forming in perfect silence, without heat or noise or any visible process except the slow lengthening of its white transparent shaft. The cold deepens as the last light drains from the sky and the crystals respond to the falling temperature by growing faster and thicker, the first fine needles now joined by broader blades and branching clusters that interlock into a solid mat across the whole surface of the liquid. The color of the liquor beneath the crystals is still dark, but the crystals themselves are brilliantly white, so white that they seem to glow with a light of their own in the deepening dusk, and they push upward from the surface in tiny peaks and ridges that catch the faint gleam of the first stars appearing overhead. You lean closer, your breath pluming in the cold air and drifting across the pan, and you see that the crystals have begun to creep up the sides of the pan as well, tiny white fingers reaching out of the liquid and climbing the copper walls in a delicate frost that looks like the patterns ice makes on a window pane. You stay kneeling beside the stone for a long time, watching the crystals grow, and the world around you grows darker and quieter with every passing minute. The dovecote fades from a grey shape to a black silhouette against the deep blue of the sky, and the ash tree overhead becomes a net of darkness that catches the stars as they appear one by one. Tiny cold points of light that seem very far away and very old. The air is so still now that you can hear the faint rustle of the dry sedge down by the brook and the distant bark of the village dog, and the soft continuous cooing of the pigeons settling into their nests for the night. And beneath all these sounds there is the deeper silence of the winter itself, a silence that presses against your ears like a physical weight and makes the small sounds seem louder by contrast. The surface of the liquid is now completely covered with a crust of interlocking crystals, a solid white lid that has pushed the remaining dark liquid down into the spaces between the crystal shafts. You reach out and touch the edge of this crust very gently with the tip of your finger, and it is hard and cold and slightly rough, like fine sandpaper, and it does not break under the light pressure, but holds its shape with a brittle firmness that suggests the whole mass is now locked together into a single crystalline lattice. The crust is perhaps half an inch thick already, and you know that it will continue to thicken as the night goes on and the temperature drops further, the remaining dissolved nitrates slowly precipitating out and adding themselves to the growing mass until the mother liquor beneath is weak and almost colorless. You rise stiffly from your kneeling position, your knees cold and your back aching from the hunched posture, and you stand for a moment with your hands tucked into your armpits, looking down at the pan and the ash tree and the dark bulk of the dovecote beyond. The stars are fully out now, a thick scattering of white across the black sky, and you can see the faint band at the Milky Way running from horizon to horizon like a river of frozen light. The constellations are the same ones that have been wheeling overhead for all the nights of your life, and for all the nights of everyone who has ever lived, and you find their steady presence reassuring in a way that you could not put into words, a reminder that the world turns and the seasons pass, and the work of saltpeter men is only one small part of a much larger order. You decide to leave the pan outside through the night rather than bringing it back into the shed, because the continued cold will draw more crystals from the solution and the night air is dry and will not dilute the mother liquor with any unwanted moisture. You check that the pan is still sitting level on the flat stone, the just one corner by a fraction of an inch, and then you turn and walk back to the shed, your footprints in the snow now so many and so overlapping that the path has become a shallow trench of packed grey ice that glints faintly in the starlight. Inside the shed, the fire has burned down to a bed of coals that glow a deep orange when you stir them with the poker, and you add a few sticks and sit on the stool to warm your hands, thinking about the crystals growing silently outside in the dark. The spigot is still dripping into the second pan, a slow, steady rhythm that has continued all through the day and will continue through the night and into tomorrow, each drop carrying a small load of nitrates out of the leaching pit and into the copper vessel. You check the level of the liquid in this second pan and find that it has risen to about a quarter full, a pale amber compared to the dark, concentrated liquor you boiled today, and you know that tomorrow you will boil this liquid as well, reducing it down and cooling it and adding its crystals to the growing store. The work is cyclical, each batch following the last in a circle that has no real end, only a continuous turning that matches the turning of the days and the gradual emptying of the leaching pit and the dovecote floor. You eat your bread and drink your water sitting by the revived fire, and then you bank the coals carefully and lie down on your bedroll, pulling the blanket up to your chin and settling into the straw. The shed is colder than usual because the door covering has been open so much during the day, but your body is tired and the blanket is thick, and soon you feel the warmth of your own breath collecting in the small space around your face. You lie in the darkness and listen to the drip of the spigot and the soft settling of the thatch above and the absolute silence of the snow outside. And you think about the pan sitting on the flat stone beneath the ash tree, the white crust of crystals slowly thickening as the cold of the night draws the last dissolved saltpeter out of the liquor. Outside, under the stars, the process continues without any need for your presence. The temperature drops further as the night deepens, the cold sinking down from the clear sky like a weight, and the copper of the pan gives up its remaining warmth to the air until it is as cold as the stone beneath it. The mother liquor shrinks a little as more of its dissolved load crystallizes out, and the crystal mat grows upward and downward at the same time, new needles forming on the bottom of the crust, and old needles thickening at their bases, the whole mass becoming denser and heavier and whiter as the hours pass. The stars wheel in their slow arcs overhead, the constellations shifting from east to west with the turning of the earth, and no one watches them except perhaps a fox crossing the common on some silent errand, or a pigeon stirring briefly in its nest before tucking its head back under its wing. The ash tree stands over the pan like a guardian, its bare branches tracing black lines across the star field, and if you were to walk out now with a lantern, you would see the crystals glittering in the light like a pan full of crushed diamonds, each facet catching and returning the flame in a tiny spark. But you do not walk out, because you are asleep in the shed with the blanket pulled close and the warmth of the banked fire still radiating faintly from the stone hearth, and the pan does its work without you, the chemistry completing itself in the dark, just as it has done for centuries in other winters and other saltpeter men's pans. The dovecote watches over it all, the round tower dark against the starry sky, and inside the tower the pigeons sleep in their rows of stone alcoves, and the earth beneath them continues its slow accumulation of new droppings that will one day be scraped and carried and mixed and leached by another pair of hands in another winter. When you wait briefly in the deepest part of the night, the shed is utterly dark, and the cold has crept in around the edges of the blanket, and you can hear no sound at all except the almost inaudible drip of the spigot, which has slowed now to one drop every 10 or 12 seconds. You lie still and listen to the silence, and you think about the pan outside with its cargo of white crystals growing thicker and harder in the freezing air, and the thought is a comforting one that sends you back down into sleep as gently as a hand smoothing a pillow. The night continues, and the stars continue, and the crystals continue, all of them moving at their own pace toward the morning that is still hours away and will arrive in its own time. You wake to a morning that is paler than any morning before it, the sky a sheet of high thin cloud that diffuses the light into a soft grey-white glow that seems to come from everywhere at once and casts no shadows on the snow. The first thing you think about as you push back the blanket and sit up in the straw is the pan beneath the ash tree, and the second thing is the linen cloth that hangs from a peg on the shed wall, a square of coarse beige fabric that has been washed many times and is now as soft as old cotton. The straining will be your task today, the careful separation of the white crystals from the amber mother liquor, and then the spreading and the drying and the slow transformation of the wet crystalline mass into a dry white powder that can be weighed and packed and stored away. You eat your bread quickly while the fire catches and the water warms, and then you take the linen cloth from its peg and walk out into the still cold morning to retrieve the pan. The pan is exactly where you left it, sitting level on the flat stone beneath the bare branches of the ash tree, and the scene it presents is one of quiet transformation completed in the dark. The surface of the liquid is now entirely covered by a thick crust of interlocking white crystals that rises slightly above the rim of the pan like a miniature mountain range, its peaks and ridges catching the pale morning light and scattering it into tiny points of brightness. The mother liquor beneath the crust has shrunk to a shallow pool of deep amber that you can see through gaps in the crystal lattice, and the crystals themselves have grown so thickly up the sides of the pan that the copper is barely visible, hidden beneath a white fur of fine needles that cling to the metal like frost to a window pane. You kneel beside the pan and press a finger gently against the crust, feeling its hardness and its coldness and the slight gritty resistance of the individual crystals shifting against each other under pressure. You carry the pan carefully back to the shed, walking with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who does not want to spill a single drop of the precious mother liquor or lose a single crystal over the rim. Inside, the fire has burned up to a steady flame, and the warmth of the shed feels almost oppressive after the sharp cold outside. But you are grateful for it, because the straining will take time, and you would rather do it without your fingers growing stiff. You set the pan on the flat stones beside the hearth and place the linen cloth over a second copper pan that you have kept clean for this purpose, pressing the center of the cloth down to form a shallow bowl and securing the corners around the rim with small smooth stones from the brook that you gathered on one of your water trips. The cloth is old but clean, and its weave is tight enough to hold even the smallest of the crystal needles, while letting the liquid pass through freely, a simple tool that has served saltpeter men for as long as saltpeter men have existed. The pouring requires both hands and all of your attention, because the crust of crystals does not want to leave the pan in a single mass, but instead breaks into sections that slide against each other and threaten to spill over the sides. You tip the pan slowly, very slowly, and the amber mother liquor runs out first, streaming through the linen cloth in a dark golden ribbon that splashes softly into the pan beneath and immediately begins to settle into a clear pool. The crystals follow in a series of small avalanches, white chunks that crumble as they move and slide down the tilted copper into the cloth, where they pile up in a glittering mound that still holds the shape of the pan's interior. You use a flat wooden spatula to scrape the last clinging needles from the walls of the pan, chasing them down the copper into the cloth, and when the pan is empty, you set it aside and look at the straining cloth with its load of wet white crystals resting in the center like a heap of crushed ice. The draining begins at once, the amber liquid passing through the weave of the linen in a slow, steady stream that gradually picks up speed until it is pouring through in a thick column that splashes into the lower pan with a sound like a small waterfall, and then, over many minutes, beginning to slow again as the bulk of the free liquid leaves the crystals and collects in the vessel beneath. You watch the color of the liquid change as it drains, the deep amber of the first flow giving way to a paler yellow, and then to a faint straw color, and finally to a thin watery wash that is barely tinted at all. And this tells you that the crystals are clean, that the mother liquor has been separated from them as completely as it can be by gravity alone. The crystals themselves sit in the cloth, a mound of glistening white that still holds a trace of moisture in the spaces between the needles, and you gather the corners of the cloth together to form a loose bag that you hang from a hook on the wall to let the last drops drain out while you prepare the drying board. The drying board is a simple thing, a wide flat plank of elm wood that you have kept clean and dry in the corner of the shed, and you bring it out now and set it on a low bench near the open doorway where the draft circulates constantly between the warm air of the interior and the cold air outside. You have chosen this spot carefully because the crystals need a steady flow of moving air to dry properly, but must not be exposed to direct sunlight, which on a winter day is weak enough to do no harm, but on a brighter day might cause the crystals to dissolve again in their own trapped moisture. The draft in the doorway is perfect, a constant gentle movement of air that you can feel on your cheek when you stand in it, and you position the board so that it catches the full current without being in the way of your other work. When the dripping from the hanging cloth has slowed to a single drop every minute or so, you take the bundle down and open it carefully over the drying board, spreading the wet crystals across the pale wood with your fingers. The crystals are cold and slightly sticky, clinging to each other in small clumps that you break apart with a gentle pressing motion, distributing them into an even layer that covers most of the board in a thin white sheet. The smell of them is clean and sharp, the pure mineral scent of potassium nitrate with none of the organic overtones of the dovecote earth or the smoky richness of the wood ash. And you hold a few of the larger crystals up to the light and see that they are semi-transparent, their inner structure visible as fine parallel lines running through the clear white mass like the grain in a piece of ice. The drying will take the rest of the day, and you will visit the board several times to turn the crystals over with your fingers and spread them again into a thin layer, ensuring that every surface is exposed to the moving air. But for now, the morning's main work is done, and you pour the drained mother liquor from the lower pan back into the boiling pan, where it will wait for the next round of reduction and crystallization, along with the contents of the second pan that is still dripping beneath the spigot. The mother liquor still holds dissolved nitrates that did not crystallize in the first cooling, and if you boil it down again and cool it again, you will get a second crop of crystals, smaller and less pure but still useful, and perhaps even a third crop after that, if the yield justifies the effort. The morning passes into the afternoon while you tend the drying board, turning the crystals every hour or so, and watching the moisture leave them by slow degrees. The white surface of the crystal layer changes from a wet glisten to a dull matte finish as the water evaporates, and the texture under your fingers changes from sticky and clumping to smooth and free-flowing, the individual needles separating from each other and becoming a loose powder that shifts easily when you push it across the board. The smell of nitrates fades as the drying progresses, the sharpness mellowing into something cleaner and almost neutral, and by the time the afternoon light has begun to deepen, the crystals are dry enough that they no longer cling to your fingers at all. You take down a small brass scale from a shelf above the hearth, an instrument that is old and worn but still accurate, its beam polished by years of handling until it gleams faintly in the firelight. Beside the scale, you set a series of heavy linen bags, each one ready to be filled with the dried saltpeter and marked with the date and the village name. The weighing is the final act of verification, the moment when the abstract work of scraping and mixing and leaching and boiling resolves itself into a number that can be recorded and reported to the committee. You scoop the dry crystals from the board with a wooden cup and pour them onto the scale pan in small increments, watching the brass beam rise and fall as the weight accumulates. The total is a little over 4 pounds of pure saltpeter from this first batch, a good yield that speaks well of the dovecote earth and the care you have taken in the preparation. You pour the weighed saltpeter into the first of the linen bags, folding the top down carefully and tying it with a length of hemp twine. The bag is heavy in your hand, a satisfying weight that feels like the compression of many days of labor into a small, solid object, and you set it on the shelf and look at it for a moment with the quiet pride of a craftsman who has made something true. Tomorrow you will boil the second pan of liquid, and the day after that you will scrape more earth from the dovecote floor, and the cycle will begin again. Another rotation of the wheel that turns slowly through the winter months. But for this evening the work of straining and drying is complete, and the first bag of saltpeter sits on the shelf as proof that the process works and will continue to work. You clean the copper pans with a rag and a little water, wiping away the last traces of the mother liquor and the crystal fragments that cling to the rims. And you hang the linen cloth over a pole near the fire, where it will dry before the morning. The shed is tidy now, the tools in their places, the fire burning steadily, and the spigot still dripping its slow rhythm into the second pan on the floor. You sit on the stool and stretch your legs out toward the flames, feeling the day's tiredness settle into your shoulders and back, a mild ache that is more pleasant than painful. Outside the light is fading, and through the doorway you can see the ash tree and the flat stone where the pan sat last night, now empty and dusted with a fresh layer of snow that fell while you were working. The crystals you collected this morning are safely packed in their linen bag, and tomorrow there will be more crystals, and the day after that there will be more still. A slow accumulation that mirrors the slow accumulation that the dovecote earth itself. The linen bags stand in a row on the shelf above the hearth, 5 of them now, each one filled with the dried white saltpeter and tied with hemp twine and marked with a piece of scrap paper that bears the date and the name of the village in your small, neat handwriting. The first bag you filled 3 days ago, the second 2 days ago, the third yesterday, and the fourth and fifth this morning after the final straining of the mother liquor that had been dripping from the spigot all through the week. You stand back from the shelf and look at the row of bags with the same quiet satisfaction you once felt when you looked at the full trough of raw earth or the dark liquid boiling in the copper pan. A satisfaction that comes from seeing a thing through from its beginning to its end. The bags are plump and heavy, each one holding between 3 and 5 pounds of pure potassium nitrate, and together they represent perhaps 20 pounds of saltpeter that has been drawn from the earth of the dovecote floor over the course of the past weeks. The committee's wagon will come in the spring, when the roads are passable again, and the bags will be loaded onto it and carried away to the powder mills, where the saltpeter will be mixed with charcoal and sulphur and ground into gunpowder. But that is not your concern. Your concern is only the work that happens here, in this shed and this dovecote, through this winter. You turn from the shelf and walk to the doorway of the shed, where the pale grey light of the afternoon falls onto the packed earth floor, in a shape that has become as familiar as the face of an old friend. The path to the dovecote is a hard grey trench in the snow now, worn down by dozens of trips with the full bucket and dozens more with the empty one. And the path to the brook is a similar trench running in the opposite direction, its surface slick with ice where the water has splashed and frozen. Between these two paths, the snow remains untouched, a smooth white blanket that covers the common from the edge of the village to the base of the ash tree, and the only marks on it are the wandering tracks of birds and the single line of fox prints that appears fresh each morning as if the animal follows a route as regular as your own. The dovecote stands on its slight rise at the edge of the common, its stone walls dark against the pale sky, and the high opening near the top is a black rectangle that occasionally frames the grey shape of a pigeon launching itself into the air or returning from some foraging expedition in the frozen fields beyond the brook. The work is not finished, and it will not be finished until the spring comes, and the dovecote floor has been scraped down to its natural soil, and the last bucket of earth has been carried and mixed and leached and boiled and crystallized. But the shape of the work is now fully established, the rhythm of it set deep into your body and your mind, and there is no longer any need to think about what comes next, because the cycle has become self-sustaining, each day flowing into the next in a pattern that repeats itself without variation. Tomorrow you will go to the dovecote and scrape another section of the crust, and you will carry the full buckets to the shed and add the fresh earth to the pile in the trough, and then you will mix it with wood ashes at the ratio of 4:1, and charge the leaching pit and pour the water through and collect the brown liquid and boil it and cool it and strain the crystals and dry them and weigh them and pack them into the 6th linen bag on the shelf linen bag on the shelf. And the day after that you will do the same thing, and the day after that the same again, until the dovecote floor is clean and the bags on the shelf are numerous enough to satisfy the committee's order. You walk out of the shed and across the common toward the dovecote, not because you need to scrape more earth today, but because you want to see the inside of the tower in the quiet of the afternoon, and to measure with your eyes how much of the floor remains to be cleared. The path is firm beneath your boots, the packed snow frozen into a surface that is almost as hard as stone, and your feet know every dip and rise of it by now. Every place where a tuft of grass pushes through, or a buried root makes a slight ridge. You pass the ash tree, its bare branches motionless in the still air, and you pass the flat stone where you set the copper pan on the night of the first crystallization, and then you reach the low wooden door of the dovecote and lift the latch and step inside. The interior of the tower is darker than the outside, as it always is, but your eyes adjust quickly now, and you can see the full curve of the wall and the rows of nest holes rising into the shadows above. The floor is a patchwork of cleared and uncleared areas, the darker earth of the scraped sections contrasting with the grey-white crust that still covers perhaps a third of the total surface, and the boundary between the two is a clean line that advances a little further each day as you work your way around the circumference. The pigeons are in their usual places, some perched on the ledges and others tucked into the nest holes, and their soft cooing fills the space with a sound that you have grown so used to that you only notice it when it stops, which it never does. The smell of ammonia is fainter now than it was in the first weeks, partly because you have removed so much of the accumulated droppings and partly because your nose has learned to filter it out, but it is still there beneath the colder smell of the winter air that comes through the high opening. You walk slowly around the inside of the wall, your boots leaving shallow prints in the loose dust that has settled on the cleared areas, and you estimate that the remaining crust will yield perhaps another 6 or 7 trough loads of raw earth before you reach the natural soil. The richest material is still ahead of you, the deep accumulation near the wall where the birds roost most thickly, and you think that the yield of saltpeter per bucket will increase as you work deeper into the older layers. The floor beneath the crust is moist and dark, and full of the slow chemistry that has been working for a century or more, and you kneel and press your hand against it for a moment, feeling the cold and the damp and the faint granular texture of the nitrates that have crystallized naturally in the earth. This is the substance you have come to collect, and it is still here, still waiting, still renewing itself as the birds above add their daily contributions to the surface. You stand and brush the dust from your hands and look up at the wooden beams that support the conical roof, the rough-hewn timbers, dark with age, and pitted with the holes of wood-boring insects. A few pigeons are perched on the beams, their grey bodies just visible in the dimness, and they look down at you with the same expression of mild indifference that they have always shown. You have grown fond of these birds in a distant sort of way, not as individuals, but as a collective presence, a constant background of soft sound and slow movement that has accompanied all your hours of work. They are the source of the nitrates and therefore the source of your occupation, but they are also something more than that, a reminder that the world continues on its own terms, regardless of what humans are doing with their rakes and their buckets and their copper pans. You leave the dovecote and close the door behind you, and the cold air of the common wraps around your face like a clean cloth. The light is beginning to fail already, the short winter day compressing the afternoon into a narrow band of grey between the long morning and the long evening, and you walk back to the shed along the hard-packed path while the first stars begin to appear in the eastern sky. Inside the shed the fire is still burning, and you add a few sticks and sit on the stool and look at the shelf where the 5 linen bags stand in their row. The 6th bag lies flat and empty beside the scale, waiting for tomorrow's crystals, and the 7th bag is folded beneath it, and the 8th and 9th and 10th are stored in a dry corner wrapped in a piece of oiled cloth to keep out the damp. The winter will continue in this way, the days passing one by one in their quiet succession, each one identical to the one before it, except that the pile of raw earth in the trough will grow a little higher and the bags on the shelf will grow a little more numerous, and the cleared area in the dovecote will expand a little further around the curve of the wall. There will be no surprises and no interruptions, because the weather is settled into its deep cold pattern, and the village is quiet and the war is somewhere else far away where it cannot reach this common or this dovecote, or this shed with its fire and its copper pans and its rows of linen bags. You have everything you need here, and what you do not have you can make or find or do without. And the work will sustain itself through the remainder of the winter, just as it has sustained itself through the weeks that have already passed. You eat your bread and drink your water and watch the fire burn down to a bed of coals. And then you bank the coals carefully and lie down on your bedroll and pull the blanket up to your chin. The shed is warm from the fire and the thatch above holds the heat close, and you lie on your back and listen to the familiar sounds of the night settling over the common, the soft rush of the wind through the bare branches of the ash tree, the distant murmur of the brook beneath its thickening ice, the occasional brief call of a pigeon from inside the dovecote. The spigot drips into the second pan with a slow, steady rhythm that has become as much a part of the night as the beating of your own heart, and you know that tomorrow morning the pan will be full enough to boil and that the cycle will begin again. You think about the dovecote earth and the wood ash and the water from the brook, the three simple ingredients that combine to make something that can move the world, and you think about the many hands that have done this work before you and the many hands that will do it after you are gone. The saltpeter men of other centuries scraped their own dovecote floors and mixed their own ashes and boiled their own copper pans, and the saltpeter men of centuries yet to come will do the same, because the birds will continue to nest in the towers, and the nitrates will continue to seep into the earth, and the committee will always need more gunpowder for whatever war is being fought. The work is older than you, and larger than you, and it will outlast you, and there is a deep comfort in that thought, a release from the burden of importance that allows you to simply do what needs to be done and then rest. Outside the shed the snow begins to fall again, a soft, silent descent of large flakes that drift down through the darkness and settle onto the common and the dovecote roof and the flat stone beneath the ash tree. The paths you have worn across the snow will be covered by morning, and you will break them fresh when you carry the first bucket from the dovecote to the shed, and by the afternoon they will be worn again into hard grey trenches that will serve you until the next snowfall covers them. This is the rhythm of the winter, the alternation of erasure and renewal, that matches the alternation of scraping and carrying and mixing and boiling, and you have learned to accept it as you accept your own breathing, without thought and without resistance. Your body grows heavy on the bedroll, and your thoughts grow slow and disjointed, and the last thing you are aware of before sleep takes you is the sound of the spigot dripping into the pan, each drop a small, precise note in the immense quiet of the winter night. The dovecote stands dark and silent on its rise. The pigeons sleep in their stone alcoves, the ash tree holds its bare branches motionless against the falling snow, and the saltpeter man rests with his tools around him, and his work waiting for the morning, and his 5 linen bags standing in their row on the shelf like a promise that will be kept. Everything continues, and nothing changes, and the winter moves forward one more night into the long calm procession of days that will end only when the spring comes and the roads soften and the committee's wagon appears on the lane from the village. Until then, there is only the scraping and the carrying and the mixing and the leaching and the boiling and the cooling and the straining and the drying and the weighing and the packing, the endless quiet repetition that fills the days and the weeks and the months, the slow harvest of nitrates from beneath the birds.